I should say at the beginning that we have Michael Schiffer at the far end. He has to leave a little bit early, so I'm going to let him go first. And he also, given his position on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, has asked that his comments not be quoted by name. The others would all like to be quoted. Anyway, Michael, why don't we start with you?
Sure. No, thank you, and my apologies in advance for needing to leave a little early. Much as I love the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, much as I love the U.S.-Japan Alliance, I love my daughter just a little bit more, and I need to go and pick her up. And also, thank you for considering what I have to say as non-attribution. As staff up in Congress, our job is to be seen and not heard. And I think we've all seen in the past couple of days the dangers that can come to people that say things without being clear in certain settings that they mean to be off the record, not for attribution. So please, as Fred said, if I say by sheer random happenstance anything that happens to be interesting, you can attribute it to a congressional staffer, but don't stick my name to it. Or if you want to quote a Michael, just spell the last name G-R-E-E-N, and we'll be fine.
Can I just pick up your daughter?
I think we may be getting onto dangerous grounds here. I guess, I'll answer the question that you put before us, Fred, sort of from a backwards perspective, from a U.S. policy perspective, which is that as we consider U.S. policy in the Asia-Pacific region, as we consider the rebalance, look to the challenges of a rising China, and try to think through how we're going to be able to create the rules-based order for the region that President Obama talks about, it is a strategic necessity that we see a Japan that is reinvigorated and fully engaged as a full-fledged security partner and diplomatic partner in the region. For the United States, the rebalance starts with our alliances, and our alliance structure in the region starts with Japan. And so if we can't find in Japan a robust partner for our efforts, and a robust partner that is able to be forward-leaning in providing public goods for the Asia-Pacific region alongside the United States, we're going to be in deep trouble. Everything we do, and I say this from just a narrow U.S. perspective, everything we do in the region radiates through and with Japan, whether that's on the security side of the ledger, looking at our posture and our base presence, or whether it's on the economic and trade side of the ledger, which is why it was such a game changer when Japan joined the TPP, and why being able to conclude negotiations with Japan on the TPP is the necessary element for being able to move that forward. And keep in mind, as I know all of you know far better than I do, when you think about things that are of real strategic significance for shaping the Asia-Pacific region for the decades ahead, TPP is of far greater weight than 2,500 Marines 6 months out of the year in Darwin, Australia, or 1,300 Marines, or whatever the final figures will be, and a certain number of airmen 6 months out of the year in the Philippines under the new basing agreement. I mean, TPP is really where it's at when we think about our position in the region, and we think about what's necessary to shape a positive and productive China, as opposed to the questions we have about the alternative with China's trajectory. And so I would say for the U.S., and I'll wrap up, there is a real premium in seeing Prime Minister Abe being able to follow through on the security agenda that he has laid out, on being able to move forward with constitutional reinterpretation, and being able to move forward with collective self-defense, and being able to move forward on the roles, missions, capabilities dialogue that we have tried to put some additional juice into in recent years, so that we can see what sort of complementary capabilities the United States and Japan, given the physical realities that we both face, can develop and deploy in the region. If we're not able to do that, as I said, there are real structural challenges for the success of U.S. policy. And so, just to stop where I started, a reinvigorated Japan, a Japan that's embarked on a new era in its security profile in the region, is an absolute necessity from a U.S. perspective.
So, Michael, Green, you've been following this long enough to know that this isn't the first time. I mean, when peacekeepers went out, it was a radical thing. When refueling happened in the Indian Ocean, it was a radical thing. Is this qualitatively different? And do you think the U.S. is going to get the robust partner that Michael Schiffer says it needs?
I think it is qualitatively different. And the reason is because it's not quantitatively different. In other words, when you face a rising challenge like China or North Korea, and your budgets are limited, your ability to increase your own defense spending has limits as well. And so smart strategy is to reach out, what the academics call external balancing, and that's what Abe is doing. Not only with us in the Defense Guidelines Review, but also with Southeast Asia, with Australia, with India, and that is a form of security as well. The whole process really began, I think, in the mid-90s. And it was for this same logic, that the Japanese economy was slowing down. Particularly in 95, 96, it became quite obvious that China was willing to use coercion. In that case, it was the Taiwan Straits crisis. And so a lot of the seeds for what we would now call Abe's strategy were planted then, and frankly, built momentum. Sometimes it slowed down, sometimes it sped up. But there's a lot of continuity, and I think most of what, if not all of what Prime Minister Abe is trying to do, his predecessor, Prime Minister Noda, wanted to do as well. But there are some big differences, and I'll just highlight a few quickly. One is, we did a survey at CSIS we're going to publish soon, where we asked 500 think tankers in Asia their views of the future of security and economic and political order in Asia. And we asked about territorial disputes. And one of the questions was, if the other side grabs the territory, should your country fight to take it back? And in China, the answer was 85%. These are think tankers. In the US, it was about 85%. And in Japan, it was 82%. So I think the seriousness...
Was it lower than that in any country?
Yes. Thailand was very low. We can talk about Thailand at another conference.
Yeah.
So you know, there's Japan's attitudes towards security policy are clearly changing. At the same time, you've probably seen polls that show more resistance to collective self-defense than probably the Prime Minister expected. So it's a bit muddy, but I think it's pretty pronounced change. The other thing I'd point to is Patrick and I, when we edited this book in the late 90s about the future of the alliance, wrote at some point the US and Japan may need to move towards something like a virtual joint and combined command, like we have with Korea or NATO. And we hedged it. We said, if might be possible that we could possibly, and Patrick's research assistant put it out first to test it. It was very tentative. We got a lot of pushback. But if you look at the attitude in the current government about Defense Guidelines Review, missile defense, intelligence sharing, there's a much more significant appetite for a virtual joint and combined relationship that you would never have seen 20 years ago because of fears of being entrapped by the US in a war somewhere in Asia. So there are some very important changes with residual sort of a pull because of Japan's strong pacifist culture.
But it's changed because of anxiety about China, Patrick? Is that the key factor?
I think the reemergence of China is the dominant theme and concern within Japan and within the region today. The latest statistics showing that China will overtake the United States, at least in purchasing power parity, as the largest economy in the world in 2014 rather than 2019, is again an indicator along the way. I'm just back from an allied country I can't name, talking with their top intelligence chiefs about 2035. And they said, tell me why, Dr. Cronin, in 2035 you think China won't be the dominant Asian military power. Leaving that debate aside, there's a lot of linear thinking and a lot of assumptions about the potential growth of China and how they may use that power. And we heard Secretary General Ishiba talk about the concern of what if China does use coercive and use of force to try to change the status quo when the system isn't to its liking, rather than to spend the time to reach out to others to build a larger regional architecture. I think we need 3 China strategies that are all part of one. One of them is to counter what I've called tailored coercion, these gray zone areas in this maritime domain. The second one is the longer term countering the anti-access area denial capabilities, which means keeping our military capabilities able to project power forward with a favorable sort of cost ratio to losses. And then the third one is the order building. It's the very, very important one. It is the inclusive rules-based system that Michael Schiffer alluded to. One thing I would say about adding on to Michael Green is I would maybe even predate our work before then to the Korean crisis. And the reality sinking in the early 90s, actually, when North Korea was threatening, as they walked away from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that if we had a military conflict on the Korean Peninsula and Japan didn't come to the assistance, as Rich Armitage was fond of saying at the time, this could really threaten the solidity of the future of the U.S.-Japan alliance, especially when we weren't moored in a post-Cold War understanding until the defense guidelines came along in the 90s, later 90s. Last point I would make about this prime minister is that having had a second bite at the apple as prime minister is so unusual is because putting ideas into action is a real skill. As somebody who works with Kurt Campbell and Michelle Flournoy and Bob Work, I have great admiration for people who can get things done in government. Not the prime minister's level, but the top level of Japan, you've had more going on and getting things done on the security front than you could argue over the previous 20 years. So that's significant qualitative change, as Mike suggested, and yet, as you pointed out, I think, Fred, in your opening sort of vignette, quantitatively, we're still under 1% of the gross domestic product on defense. We heard Secretary General talk about the constraints on a UN charter-based collective self-defense rights. These are very responsible steps, I think, in terms of the security front. But they have a hard edge because there's so much uncertainty about this reemerging China, coupled with the still existing problem with North Korea.
Abe, how significant is it, and what's the most significant piece of it, if you think something real is going on?
Yeah, I do think that there's something happening here, as they say.
Yeah.
But I don't think that we're quite there yet. I think that if you look at the initiatives that are on the table right now in terms of TPP, in terms of FUTENMA and the revised defense guidelines that are being discussed and negotiated, these are the items that are still up in the air. And I think that if we're able to conclude them and we're able to move forward with them, then I think you have a significant change in Japan's approach, in the alliance dynamics. Until we really get to that point, I think you can say it's a major change or a change similar to what we've seen in the past few years, but really looking at something, calling something significant. There's still, I think, a few things that need to get past the finish line. TPP and especially the defense guidelines being the most substantial. If you look at, in terms of trying to decide what's the most important, I think that really depends on, what someone's issue bent is. Since I'm not an economics guy, I'm not a trade guy, I of course focus more on the bilateral defense guidelines as being the most important, especially for the topic of this panel. But if you look at it strategically over the next 20, 30 years, my sense would be that concluding TPP with Japan as part of it would probably have the most significant long-term geopolitical impact.
Well, in that case, let's do a quick detour to Obama's trip. And, did he get what he should have gotten on TPP? Where do you guys think we stand, and what are the prospects?
Well, I think he went into the trip on TPP with one hand tied behind his back because the Japanese side was not going to give its best offer until it saw evidence the president was willing to put on his armor and take the fight to Congress to get it passed. Usually that's proven with Trade Promotion Authority or fast track. Whether you technically need Trade Promotion Authority or can wait is another question, but there was no demonstration. In fact, you'll recall after the State of the Union where the president lightly touched on TPP and Trade Promotion Authority, and Harry Reid came down the next day and said, no, there was silence from the White House. So given all that, it was unlikely they were going to get much. And yet, I think it sounds like quite a bit was accomplished on the market barrier issues. you know, the prime minister wasn't going to achieve a deal with the president in Tokyo because that's bad politics. He had there was an election in Kagoshima the next few days too. So for a variety of reasons, I think it's possible that we'll find in subsequent meetings in May and so forth that there was substantial progress and it could get done in the lame duck session of Congress. I think the jury's out. I wouldn't count it as a failure on TPP. On the security side, I think the president accomplished a lot. I think there's bipartisan support for what he did. And I find a little bit unbelievable this narrative that's in both media, US and Japanese, that somehow the president got tricked. He gave everything Abe wanted on security and got nothing on TPP. That defies the logic of these summits. You don't trade security for pork, A. B, he got a lot.
Or beef.
Or even beef. And he got the Japanese prime minister signed on to sanctions on Russia for the first time in history, well, first time since the Cold War. So that was a big deal. So I think the administration should be pretty happy with the trip, but it really, as everyone says, TPP is so critical. It depends on what they do with what progress they did make.
Let me ask the senior congressional official who shall not be named. Can TPP get through this Congress, next Congress, Republican Senate, Democratic Senate? How do you see it all playing out?
I mean, my sense is that TPP can get done. I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the final details and can get through Congress. TPA is a much heavier lift because with Trade Promotion Authority, from a congressional perspective, you're essentially giving the president a blank check and you don't know what you're getting back in return. With TPP, you at least, or TTIP on the European side, right? You have a structure of a deal. Yes, there'll be constituencies that will be unhappy and sectors that will be unhappy, but you'll also be able to mobilize support from those sectors that are going to win and those parts of the business community that are going to do well. It's a narrow road to get TPP done during the lame duck. It's going to require, and Mike is absolutely right on this. It's going to require the administration really girding up, and not just the president, but a full court press across all of the different departments and agencies that have an interest in this to really get up there and work the hill, and we haven't really seen that yet. But if they're able to close down negotiations over the next couple of months and really start to go out there and lay the groundwork, then I think it is, again, narrow road, but it is possible to get TPP through when the lame duck comes back in after the elections.
On every stop of his trip, the first question to President Obama had to do with Ukraine. And this morning, in fact, former Minister Morimoto made a very direct comparison between Russia's hegemonic behavior, I'm quoting, in Crimea and hegemonic activity in the South China Sea. So my question is, if any of you would speak to how Ukraine, and in particular the U.S. response to Ukraine is being seen in Japan first and then in Asia. Is it, as some critics here say, oh, look, we signed a deal in 1994 to protect Ukraine and we haven't, and therefore who in Asia can count on us? Or is it, people see it as a completely different situation, or is it making them more nervous and in need of, how does it play, if at all?
Fred, I'll be happy to take that question up. I mean, if I can just get back and talk about the three big trends in which we're trying to reassess the U.S.-Japan alliance. One of them is the reemerging China I talked about. The third one is the subject of this panel, which is Japan sort of normalizing its defense and security posture gradually over time. And the middle one is really this question about the future of the United States, including its armed forces and its leadership, as we recalibrate out of two protracted ground wars, as President Obama made that fairly defensive his own foreign policy at the end of the trip. I thought excessively defensive. I think he needed to be more positive about the vision of trying to build a rules-based inclusive system, because diplomacy first is sort of common sense. It's not a bad thing. Nonetheless, there's the perception in Japan, with other allies and partners, that there's nobody calling the shots anymore, that we live in a post-war post-World War II system that the United States helped to largely craft and create, in which the United States is now ambivalent about the leadership of, or is incapable of leading. Now, that may not be a fair assessment, but I think it is one that is pervasive, and it comes from many things. It comes from the retrenchment from Afghanistan and Iraq, the need to sort of catch our breath and reinvest in the future, the need, therefore, not to get involved in any engagements. But as we heard from Secretary General Ishiba, by asking the question, as the head of the leading party in Japan, whether our inaction or non-use of force over Syria and chemical weapons gave a green light to Putin in the Crimea, I think the answer is pretty clear, that our allies, some of our allies, think we are not leading. And so leadership, power are very important, even though I think the president's on the right track in terms of building the right system and vision. We still have to be very active in terms of shaping these very complex disputes and crises. And I think there is not a causal effect between grabbing the Crimea, annexing it on the Russia's part, and further coercion in the East and South China Seas. But I do think it feeds to this narrative that it's up to regional powers to decide what the rules are, because there is nobody enforcing in this anarchical society, which is in transition right now.
So that leads to a question of, the discussion today, the Japanese collective self-defense and the modest increase in the defense budget has all been in the context of the U.S.-Japan alliance, and we need to work together better. But privately, you do hear I do hear some people in Asia say, no, Japan is really not just hedging against China, they're hedging against our withdrawal, and that this buildup is an acknowledgement that Japan has to prepare for a world in which it can't count on the United States anymore. Is there any truth? You can speak to whether the perception is true, but also, is there any truth to that being a motivation for what Japan is doing, do you think?
Yeah, I don't see that much truth to it, to be honest. With the major deciding factor to me is that if it were true, if Japan were increasing its defense budget out of concern that the United States is not a credible ally, then 1% is not going to cut it. It's going to be a tremendous difference in terms of what they're going to need to invest and spend in their defense. And everything that you see, everything that I've seen coming out of Tokyo lends credence to what we've been hearing today, is that this is investment in the alliance, investment in becoming a more capable and credible ally. To comment a bit on what Patrick was saying, to add a bit more color to it, I guess, my think tank, National Bureau of Asian Research, just last week published a series of short analyses from around the region on this question of Ukraine and what this means from their perspectives. And we actually got, and this is available on our website, and we actually got a very diverse set of opinions from this, suggesting to me that the opinion hasn't really solidified yet. Many people reflecting what Patrick said, but several others saying, isn't this a good thing that the United States isn't bogged down in some conflict that it doesn't really have all that much of an influence in, distracting them yet again from Asia, in an area that, if we believe the rhetoric of rebalancing, that Asia is important, then that means that it's more important than some other places. And I think that some folks in the region have actually come to the conclusion that this is actually a demonstration of the prudent use of force and power, or non-use of force and power. It's something that they can see as somewhat helpful. But to go back to your original question, I think that when it comes to with Patrick's point on all of this, the United States sees Ukraine obviously as somewhat important, but ultimately not worth the use of force, considering what's happened so far and the priorities that we put in place. If we're going to be facing limited budgets, self-constrained power, then that means that we need to be able to prioritize. And ultimately that means deciding what we're going to do, and again, what we're not going to do.
Admiral Blair at lunch pointed out that there's various levels of opposition or kinds of opposition in Japan to this new, part of it he characterized as less principled, which is, well, if the United States is going to shoulder the load, why should we bother? And some of it is more principled, that there's true pacifism and pride in the stance that Japan has had since the end of World War II. I think you might say that probably the same is true in neighboring states. There's some very disingenuous use of the militarism specter in the interests of the countries that are using it, but also some genuine fear of militarism reemerging in Japan. And I'm curious, we don't ask this that much, but is there any reason to fear that this is the beginning of a new and more militaristic, more nationalistic kind of Japan? If not, why aren't you worried about it? To what extent do you think there are these legitimate worries in Korea or China or other countries?
I'll take a first whack at it. From my perspective, I think the idea that we're seeing the reemergence of a militaristic Japan, and that this is, that Abe is 1937 all over again, is a canard that's being, very cynically manipulated by others in the region. I don't lose any sleep whatsoever over concerns that we're seeing a remilitarized Japan. I think society and culture in Japan have changed very, very profoundly over the past 60 years, 70 years, and we see that on a daily basis. That having been said, this does speak to why it is so critically important for the Prime Minister and other Japanese political leaders to figure out how to effectively put the history issues and historical questions to rest. Those questions, whether the United States likes it or not, provide the context for Japan's reemergence as a normal power, or as a fill in the blank, however it is that we're characterizing them, power in the region in the 21st century. And if those issues continue to play as they have played over the past year or so, they will be a strategic drag for Japan. There's very little question about that, and they will present real challenges in being able to translate the sorts of security equities that Japan might be trying to gain, even with only a 1% or barely that budgetary increase, into a greater diplomatic role, greater political role, leadership in the region. And it is incumbent on the Prime Minister, if he wants to see his strategic vision come to life, to figure out an appropriate way to address those issues, to meet the legitimate concerns, and not all the concerns that get raised on some of these issues are legitimate, but there are more than a few that are, to meet the legitimate concerns, particularly where South Korea is concerned, and figure out a way to be able to move the ball forward. And the responsibility for that does lie first and foremost on his shoulders.
The conventional wisdom about Japan has been that after the war, the country embraced this idealistic pacifist culture and was happy. And now somehow, if that culture collapses, it will be replaced by what was there before. We'll go back. I just think that's a wrong interpretation of Japanese post-war history. There certainly was pacifism. There certainly was idealism. But Shigeru Yoshida's decision to, for example, embrace Article 9 was so that Japan could focus on economic recovery and not have to be pulled into American Cold War ventures. There's a very realist logic to Japan's choices on policy in the post-war period. And so if the United States is not willing or able to provide adequate security, to me it's quite logical that in time, as a rational Japanese state will start hedging or looking for things. Do I worry about militarism? No. But I don't think we should just completely dismiss the security challenges Japan faces or be unaware of how our decisions shape Japanese thinking. I am not worried because the choices that the government is making, and it has, I think, pretty strong bipartisan support, is to lock more closely with the United States in an alliance. Michael makes an important point about history. I think the Prime Minister has a very smart strategy in terms of reaching out to other states to build security partnerships. And there's a lot of enthusiasm for that in India, in Australia, in the Philippines, but elsewhere as well. Ultimately, the variable in the region that matters the most to Japanese security is Korea.
Yeah.
And so for this strategy of reaching out and building partnerships to really work, I do think that the Japanese government has to be very attentive, painful though it may be, to attitudes in Korea to make this overall strategy work.
I do want to open to questions soon, but let's talk a little bit about Korea first, and then we can do that. There's been, again, I think Admiral Blair talked about, but others too today, about the importance of collective self-defense in the connection of protecting against North Korea, and how much more effective any kind of missile defense system would be if it was really trilateral and Japan didn't have to just say it was only protecting Japanese territory. It made me wonder two things. One is, have we moved from a policy of saying North Korea can't be nuclear to a policy of containment? That we can't say that out loud, but effectively it sounded a lot like that, number one. And number two, given the pretty deep-seated tension that we've seen between Japan and South Korea, how realistic is that kind of trilateral defense vision, even if Prime Minister Abe manages to shift the collective self-defense rule in Japan? Patrick, maybe you could take one of those.
Sure. Very briefly, I've written a new report on North Korea called If Deterrence Fails, Rethinking Conflict on the Korean Peninsula. I have a very dark view because I see we're not in charge of that containment. That is, North Korea's dynamics could trigger a failure of deterrence, could lead to escalation in so many different ways that are too complex to sort of describe singularly, that we have to be ready for uncertainty and for potential escalation. So for South Korea's government not to be talking contingency planning with Japan and with the United States together is against South Korean interests. It's against Japan's interests. It's against the US interests. That's why the president at The Hague got the three together and said, look, the three of us need to be working things out. We're not going to mediate, but we need to facilitate cooperation. Since then, we've seen progress. We've even seen progress on the sex slave issue. And I'm confident that by the end of this year, there will be an agreement announced out of Seoul and Tokyo to help deal and lessen the tensions and that have been so heightened on that issue of comfort women. That'll pave the way not only for a summit next year, but for the kind of intelligence sharing, the missile defense sharing that have been held up by this history issue. At least for me, that'll be a big litmus test for how well this relationship is moving forward. Now, I caution, it's not just going to be forward progress. It's going to fluctuate back and forth, but I see forward progress in the year ahead.
Okay, why don't we see if there are questions in the audience? There's one in front here. Please keep the questions brief and make them real questions if you would.
Gentlemen. Okay. My name is Chen, and I'm the advisor of the Taiwan government. Probably you gentlemen has never heard of this name. What is Taiwan government? Okay, but I'm not standing on my standing. I'm focused on today's subject, Japan's new security policy and capabilities. I believe from this morning until now, I feel there's a big hole, missing a big item in this discussion. South to the Senkaku Island, there's a big island called Taiwan. Population 23 million over there. And today, Uncle Sam said, there's no ROC, there's no Republic of China, blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. But every day, since 1945 until today, this moment, the legal name on Taiwan, not in this country, called Republic of China, governed by Constitution of Republic of China.
Let me ask you to get to the question, if you would.
That's a question. The President of Republic of China said, we don't mind to have a war against Japan on the issue of Senkaku Island, number one. Number two, the President of Republic of China said clearly on TV, the final destination of Taiwan is to be unified by PRC. Okay, now the question, you gentlemen never mentioned about that, and Uncle Sam depend on ROC until today. But with the name of Taiwan, they don't use the name of ROC. So PRC said, we can buy out Taiwan, buy out, number one, no war. Number two, we fire, no one bullet, can take over Taiwan.
Okay.
So what are you going to do?
Thank you. We haven't talked about Senkaku, and I don't know if any of you want to take that on, and including how the Taiwan piece of it might play into the Japan-China frictions over those islands.
Let me take a first stab, if I may. I get the feeling you don't like Ma Ying-jeou. The U.S. strategy documents, I'm writing it. We're all pumping our work, in case you didn't notice.
I was going to say, we're all going to leave with a lot of homework.
I've got a long-running project on the history of U.S. strategy, and I've gone through a lot of declassified. What's really interesting is, for most of the Cold War, when the U.S. referred to strategic interests in Asia, it talked about the offshore island chain, consistently, from Kennan to Nixon, so on and so forth, which is Japan, Senkaku's Taiwan, Philippines. And then it sort of falls out of the lexicon in thinking of American strategic leaders until the last few years. And I mention that because U.S.-China policy is not the one China policy and so forth. The Taiwan Relations Act and the rest of the liturgy are not going to change in the near term. But I think the U.S. strategically needs to be thinking a lot more about the security of Taiwan in the context of this first island chain. And for Japan, that has always been very, very important. And if we're going to work together with Japan on security in the region, I think we need much more dialogue than we currently have about the importance of the security of Taiwan. And I'm not suggesting changes in either of our policies, but it needs to be elevated as an issue in our dialogue.
Let me just throw out a Senkaku follow-up, again from Ukraine. I mean, you hear it say that the Ukraine model could be useful, that Chinese civilians, fishermen, whatever, managed to occupy the islands. And then, is the United States really going to go to war to evict a bunch of civilians from a few piles of rock in the Pacific? And instead we're left with a kind of, facts on the ground that we object to, but can't do much about.
I think when Beijing looks at the Crimea scenario,
Yeah.
they don't think, hey, we could get guys in black masks and have them land on the Senkakus and take over rocks. I think what they see is, hey, guys with black masks, just separated territory, and Xinjiang, Tibet, and the rest comes to mind. So I don't think there's a direct lessons learned for the Central Military Commission in Beijing in terms of the Russian actions. There may be some tactical lessons, but I don't think there's a major strategic lesson based on Russia's action. I think the real question is what Patrick raised, which is about how countries judge U.S. willpower. And I agree with Patrick. The president had a good trip, but that last statement where he was unable and almost sort of stumbled into a defensive answer about what his overall foreign policy strategy was unfortunate because it came at the end of a pretty successful series of security building visits.
If I can just offer one thought, and then I apologize to everybody again, but I'll be heading for the exits. I certainly agree with Patrick's point earlier that there is a perception issue that the president and that the United States more broadly needs to deal with about that's been raised by Syria and the Ukraine Crimea situation. But As Abe suggested, if we're not able to distinguish between cases where the United States has an overriding national security interest and alliance commitments, and those where the security, the national security interest is at least highly questionable and up for debate, and where we have no alliance commitments, then it's hard to tell what it is exactly we're doing when it comes to national security strategy. And that should be a distinction that is possible to explain and possible to understand.
I think that makes sense, but I would just add, if I could, in response to Abe's point, that if so, then the fact that the United States is now going to have to recommit to the NATO alliance, I mean, never mind Ukraine, it seems to me will once again raise questions about rebalance, is the rebalance being put off again? But anyway, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah. To go back to this issue, your original question.
Yeah, whatever that was.
About the lessons of the guys in black masks
Yeah.
potentially going on to Senkaku.
Yeah.
This is actually a question that's being raised in Japan in the context of the new bilateral defense guidelines, under the overall term of gray zones, in which it's unclear areas between overt acts of war and stable peace that attempt to change the status quo that this may fall under, because legally the ability of the SDF to defend Japan under these unclear circumstances is, the legal framework there is a bit unclear. And this is actually, I think, going to be one of the major issues being discussed in the new defense guidelines, is making those separations between civilian and military clear, enhancing the ability of civilian and military forces to cooperate more, both within the Japanese interagency and between Japan's forces and U.S. forces. I think is going to be part of the new discussions on the new defense guidelines. So you have an interesting dynamic where there's a scenario that I agree with Mike that's incredibly low potential for it to actually happening, but it actually driving, I think, a very important and very consequential alliance discussion about division of labor, about coordination and cooperation between our two sides, and interagency cooperation within our governments and between the two sides.
All right. Is there anybody from Japan who has a question?
Yamaguchi.
Thank you very much. My name is Yamaguchi, National Defense Academy of Japan. My question is how serious do you feel about current Japanese-Korean relations? This is because one of a friend of mine in Tokyo was really serious about the bad relation between Korea and Japan. Because South Korea is facing the very, very serious threat of North Korea. Then, if Japanese and South Koreans are not getting along with well, or even some of the Japanese very, very nationalistic kind of hate speech. It is hate Korea kind of speech is done, particularly in the social network systems. And in that sense, a friend of mine told us that saying really bad thing against South Korea means giving ammunition to North Korea. That is really serious. That is totally against Japanese national interest. If that is true, that kind of very minority in Japan, but that kind of voice is totally negative to Japanese national interests. Also, that may affect negatively to Korean, and that may happen vice versa. If Korea Koreans hate us too much. That may make the cooperation between Korea and Japan, in case of real contingency on the peninsula, may becomes really dangerous. In that sense, my question may be how serious you are about the situation in Korea, on the Korean peninsula, or how serious you are about the Korean-Japanese relation. Thank you very much.
And the role of public opinion, and why is public opinion seem to be getting worse when nobody alive remembers the sex slaves? Anybody want to take that on?
One poll, not on.
I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people.
Yes. I mean, in China, the region is worrisome. It should be worrisome for all of us. In China, it colors different ways. I worry about Chinese nationalism maybe most because the fear of a slowdown and failing to meet expectations and having to manage so many myriad challenges could lead either to kind of pressure a popular issue like Japan, beat up on Japan, or it could conversely lead to silence on Japan because they're afraid of uprisings that could turn against the Communist Party. In Korea, I worry about restricting the ability of our political leaders, and this, President Park and Prime Minister Abe in Japan, to make compromise. And that's where I think President Obama played a critical facilitating role. He said, look, it's all right for these countries to compromise because North Korea is a very serious, uncertain situation. And we have serious national interests involved here. We have to figure out, in addition to the long-sighted goals that we all want to share in terms of economic trade and so on. So it is a very serious issue in North Korea. We have to somehow tamp down this nationalist fervor and deal with the issues and move forward. Last bit about nationalism. It was in the Washington Post this morning. Fred, I was happy to get my China Daily insert with the latest news out of China, which was all about the Nanjing massacre. And I thought, of course, this was just a coincidence that they have this bit of news today. But, it's a very serious historical issue, but it's being fed by a government and encouraged by a government. They're using lawfare, they're using propaganda and information and public diplomacy, they're using coercion. And so we have to fashion in our messy democracies, and despite nationalist sentiments that may be on the fringes, a centrist point of view of how we move forward with an inclusive rules-based system. That's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of work every day. We want China to be part of that. And we're going to have to work together and overcome, therefore, differences between Koreans and Japanese, if that's going to happen. Because without Korea and Japan, it doesn't happen.
Patrick's going to kill me for telling this story, but in 97, the Pentagon asked me and Patrick and a few other people to put together a scenario game on the Korean Peninsula that involved the U.S. and Japanese officials negotiating the defense guidelines, and also Korean officials and military officers. And the purpose was to demonstrate to our Korean friends why the U.S.-Japan alliance needed to be upgraded. And the Korean side realized when we did this game that the U.S.-Japan team, and then Colonel Yamaguchi was there, Lieutenant Colonel Yamaguchi, and it wasn't his fault, but the Korean side realized, oh my gosh, the U.S.-Japan alliance is not ready for prime time. If there's a crisis on the peninsula, all the forces have to flow through Japan, which will be under attack from North Korea also. And so the Korean government quietly supported the defense guidelines review, and when the PLA sent its delegation to Seoul to try to get Korea to oppose what Japan was doing, the Ministry of Defense in Korea said, no, this is in Korea's national interest. So when we're doing the defense guidelines now, that's the scenario we need. Mm-hmm. If we get the defense guidelines review done, collective self-defense done, but somehow it raises Korean opposition, then it will be something of a Pyrrhic victory. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I am worried about the anti-Korean nationalism in Japan. And I think political leaders in Japan should speak out against it more clearly, in my view. But I do think the trilateral in The Hague, the recent trilateral defense talks, the Korea-Japan dialogue at the Director General level has stopped the downward trend and begun to pick things up a bit. Mm-hmm. And so I'm cautiously optimistic, but it really is important.
I think it's important to be a bit nuanced when talking about nationalism in Northeast Asia. And to not just say, nationalism is a big problem in China, Japan, and Korea, because I actually think that they're very different characters. that the nationalism that you see in Japan, the nationalism that you see in South Korea exists within a democratic polity. So that people have their views, some of them more extreme. Even some the politicians have their views that may be a bit outside of the norm, but they can only do so much to push a point of view, however radical it may be. And even within that, especially in Japan, I'd say, even within that group of people who we would describe as nationalists, most of them, it's very inward looking, in that it's wanting to change Japan from the inside into a more normal country, which I think for both of those countries, it's completely different from what you see in China, in which nationalism is an official government policy and is something that's stoked amongst the people by the government for domestic political and geopolitical ends, in which a country focuses like a laser on certain historical incidents, like Nanjing, for political effect, while ignoring other historical events that were more recent for political effect. And I think it's important to acknowledge that these are very different kinds of nationalism. The other thing I would stop here is that China's nationalism is also very externally focused, in that it's looking at areas where China has been aggrieved historically, according to their narrative, looking at places like the Senkaku in the South China Sea as an area to stoke nationalist fervor in an expansionist way. So both in terms of politically and in terms of the character and nature of the nationalism, I think it's very important to acknowledge that there's some very important differences.
I think that's a very useful observation. And I would just add as a footnote that I think when you're looking at polling, it's also important to evaluate polls coming out of authoritarian countries in a slightly different way than out of democratic countries.
You mean Kim Jong-un doesn't have 99.9% support?
Well, there are exceptions. All right, I think I'm being told that it's time for recess, and so thank you very much. I think we can all agree this was a great panel, so thank you.
Thank you.